Sandra Hirsch.
And I'm Jim Carney, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education.
The pool of mayoral candidates continues to expand, with a large field of Democratic contenders and a variety of Republicans and even independents. One candidate, Bill Thompson, almost unseated the heavily self-financed Mayor Bloomberg in 2009. Today he joins us to discuss his views on education and what he sees as the next mayor's education priorities.
Education is one of the hottest topics on the agenda for each of the mayoral candidates, and we'll continue to bring you exclusive interviews with them as we progress towards the November election. Also, later in the program, I'll have a conversation with a former member of the Board of Education who served alongside Mr. Thompson. And now let's join him and Linda in the studio.
My guest today is Bill Thompson, Democratic mayoral candidate. Mr. Thompson serves as the city's controller from 2002 to 2009. He also served as president of the Board of Education for 5 terms. He's chair of Governor Cuomo's minority and women-owned business enterprise and also has extensive experience in the business community. Bill Thompson is a native New Yorker and attended New York City public schools. Welcome to EdCast.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
Thanks for joining us. I
Pleasure.
want to start with your many years of experience on the Board of Education. You served 5 terms as its president. How would you say the landscape has changed from then to now, and what do you take away from your experience?
It's changed in some ways for the better, in some ways not. I mean, I think if you go back and look, the Board of Education, the old Board of Education, had more transparency than exists. I know, it's amazing, but more transparency than exists right now. While you know there were concerns about districts and the bureaucracy there, and I would never want to see us go back to that. There also was a place for parents to go to be able to be heard. And you know, I would say that while mayoral control, and I support mayoral control and think it's a good idea, I think right now the lack of transparency, places that parents don't know how to, where to go, how to navigate a system, and where to go to get additional information. Those are some of the problems. Obviously, mayoral control and being able to do things faster and quicker, and knowing exactly who's responsible and accountable, I think has helped.
Now, of course, we don't expect too many candidates to say they don't support mayoral control, but I do want to ask you, in terms of parent involvement, that's been one of the big complaints, I think, against what's going on right now. How could you increase parental control, or just the voices of parents and communities in terms of education? What might you do for that?
I think there are a number of different things that need to be done there. The first thing that, parents in a lot of ways, parents want to be involved in their children's lives and want to be involved in their education. A lot of parents don't know what to ask about and what to, how to engage the teacher and the school that their student goes to, that their child goes to. I've always advocated, obviously parent training in a lot of ways, but almost a parent university. So that, what should you ask? Ways to hold teachers and professionals accountable, knowing what to ask your child and how to follow up and be helpful to your child. I think it's important that we should do a parent, if you will, a parent, university in a lot of ways. That would be helpful in being able to help frame a lot of that for parents, and then having some parents being able to go back and work with others and help to train them. All those things I think are important. But also on a school level, there are vehicles that are there for parents. They need to be used. They need to be utilized. When mayoral control was conceived, there were parent involvement opportunities built in. No one's paying attention to that these days, and everyone from the chancellor on down doesn't think it's important. Also, the PEP, I was going
to mention that.
The
Should
priorities
parents have
education
a voice in PEP?
Absolutely. They should have seats on the board.
So would you make it less of a rubber stamp?
Absolutely. I mean, in the end, if you can't, I mean, one of the more glaring moments that we've seen over the years was, the mayor wanted to implement, the mayor and at that point Chancellor Klein wanted to implement summer school. They wanted to, to say, theoretically, they were talking about ending social promotion and students having to go to summer school. Well, the reality was you can't vote that in April. It should be done in September, so everybody understands at the beginning of a school year what the rules are going to be. They tried to implement it in April. A number of the members of the board didn't agree, so they removed them and put commissioners on the board. That is the PEP at its worst. I don't think you need to have more parents on that body who have a real voice. And if you have an entity like the old Board of Education, where people realize they could come, speak to all the members of the board, as well as the chancellor, and be heard. Any citizen could come down and have 3 minutes to be able to speak. That doesn't exist anymore.
So let's go back for a minute then. So there are some things in the new schema that are maybe worth building on, and maybe some things that are not. In terms of this mayor has been a big champion of charter schools and a big champion of closing down what is perceived to be failing schools. And you notice how I phrase that, because we just did a show on closing schools, and maybe the perceptions are not exactly what everyone thinks. But what are some of your thoughts about the charter schools and the closing down of so many schools? Over 100 schools have been closed.
True, and the one thing, it's going to make a clear separation that closing of schools shouldn't have anything to do with the discussion of charter schools.
But in some cases, some people say that they're closed to make room for a charter.
And that's the unfortunate thing, is that people, have been led to believe that at this point. And in a lot of ways, that is a failing of the mayor and of the chancellor. No matter who that chancellor has been in the last 10 or 11 years. When it comes to school closings, they're using the closing of schools almost as an educational policy. There is something wrong with that. Going back in the show, perhaps it is to show that I don't trust the current administration in that regard. Back in the spring, I'd suggested a moratorium on school closings until the end of 2013. And I think that right now, others have agreed with that, and a number of people have suggested there be a moratorium on school closing, even to the point of, if necessary, passing state legislation to make sure that occurs. Closing schools, and it's funny, as we sit here and talk, one of my former colleagues on the New York City Board of Education, the former Bronx member, Sandra Lerner, is here. Yeah. There was something that we put in place when we were members of the New York City Board of Education, something called the Chancellor's District. Failing schools would go into the Chancellor's District. You cap the schools at a certain number of students. You put an intensive curriculum in place, very regimented curriculum. You added dollars into that. You put money into the school. You had real focus on professional development. And in the end, those schools turned around.
So that brings us to a big point. One of the biggest problems we think now in education is the glaring achievement gap that exists between Black and Latino students and Asian students and white students. Do you have any suggestions for how we might close that achievement gap?
Well, I think a lot of the things that we need to do to move all students forward, it's to focus in early grades. And what does grade size look like in grades kindergarten and first and second and third grade? That's where you want to create a lot of focus in working in smaller classes, working in some of the basics, reading, writing, math, starting students out. That's one way to start to close a gap, an achievement gap between students. A lot of focus in some very basics. It's nice to see phonics is back in the school system again after they went through a process of taking it out and then, putting it back in. But at the same point, it is...
That was always misunderstood, but we don't have time for that now.
And I think that...
But yes, it's hard to find the right pedagogy, let's say that
exactly,
for sure.
and changing again. So next year it'll be Common Core in a lot of ways. But I think that if you look at the need to focus in early grades and focus in a lot of the basics, that helps to close the achievement gap. As you continue and move through school in later grades, students who are having problems, we need more time on task. So all of that is part of an extended day. Part of that may be bringing students who need support in on a Saturday and other times. All of that needs to be created as part of a larger opportunity to close the achievement gap.
There's been some real concern that all this emphasis on improving student scores in reading and math has led to an overemphasis on testing and a disappearance in the curriculum of things like arts. I know you've made some statements about arts and education. Let's talk about that a little bit. Do you think we have a culture that is testing excessively? Are we missing the boat on what students need to learn in schools? What do you think?
I think we clearly have gone way past the point of, are we focusing too much on standardized testing? Absolutely. There is way too much time focused on test prep and standardized testing. If you're going to do more testing, do it in diagnostic ways, be able to use that to be able to find out where students really need help, not just whether that student is, yes or no, how well they're doing, and then somehow that determines fully how a teacher is doing as far as preparation and teaching students. We have cut out way too much art and music education, phys ed, creating geography. I mean, there's so many things that have changed over years, and most of it has focused on test prep. You talk to teachers, almost all of them will tell you they wanted to be a teacher to be able to teach children, not to be able to sit there and just take them through test prep. So we've kind of crossed the line on an excessive amount of test preparation.
You mentioned, I think, in your biography that you're the parent of a New York City teacher. Is that, can I assume that was your mom, or?
No, my mother was a New York City public school teacher for almost 30 years.
So,
my daughter taught
okay.
in the New York City public school system. She hasn't in the last year. She will probably be back again. But she taught in the New York City public school system for 4 years.
So let's go back to your mother and your daughter and your mother's experience. Do you think your mother would want to be a teacher right now, or in what way do you think her experiences would be very different now? And what'd your daughter think, being a teacher?
That's a great question. I mean, I think my mother would have been stifled in a lot of ways by what teachers are being forced to do and to teach to these days. She was someone, and I mean, there was a teacher I remember sitting with probably in 2005, a group of teachers, maybe 2004, and speaking to them about what they were going through. And one teacher said, I'll never forget it. She laid out and said, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. I have to start reading with my students. At 10 o'clock, I have to stop, no matter what. And she said, I can clearly see that at least a third of my children didn't get it. I need to spend more time there, but I'm not allowed to. My mother would have been frustrated by that. I mean, I still run into former students. My mother was a third grade teacher for a good portion of her career. I still run into students who talk about my mother having helped to create the love of learning and love of reading when they were in her class. I've run into some of her former students who talked about my mother as their role model, and they wanted to be like her when they grew up, and they're public school teachers today. That was what teaching was about. It was about working with your students to help them achieve the best that they could. And I don't know that right now that teachers are being allowed to do that. So I think my mother would have been frustrated. My daughter...
I'm going to take a guess and say the teachers right now are not allowed to do that. I'm going to
Yes.
jump right in and say, because I have to worry so much about the test scores, how their students are doing on test scores, and now, of course, this whole added component of teacher evaluation. Now, I have to say that's one that... What are some of your thoughts about that? Clearly, there's haven't reached an agreement yet, city's lost money, but what do you think about how teachers should be evaluated in a way that contributes to their love of teaching and students' love of learning?
Well,
Can we reconcile that? Can we do that?
Absolutely. And I think the first thing is, as we look at the mayor's failure to come to agreement with the teachers union, and the fact that we walked away and lost $250 million, that is outrageous.
What could have been done differently there?
Oh, something, if there was agreement, and I think everybody in the state education department had indicated there was agreement, and the mayor dug his heels in over the sunset provision that was there. I think almost every other school district in the state of New York had a 1-year sunset. New York City was going to have a 2-year sunset, and that wasn't good enough for Mike Bloomberg. What a mistake. So I think that that's the first thing in being looking to create some type of balance. I think in this point, this my way or the highway type attitude is wrong. But back to evaluations for a second. Look, you can't, there are those who would like to say it's just based on standardized testing. If you do that, then all you'll have are test prep factories, and that's what our schools are becoming. Teacher evaluation needs to be multifaceted. It needs to look at standardized testing as part of it. What about principal observation? I think that needs to be part of it. Peer evaluation, that needs to be part of it. How are students doing in portfolio? I mean, there are a number of things that should go into that, into teacher evaluation. And then last but not least, particularly when it comes to English language learners and special ed students, you need to be able to look at a number of indicators there so teachers aren't somehow scared. Or sitting there saying, I don't want to teach a special ed class, I don't want special ed students, I don't want to see more students mainstreamed. and resistant to that. So you also have to have a real acknowledgement of that, and that has to be built in also.
We've kind of set a trap for teachers because the more English language learners and special needs students you have, the lower the test scores are, obviously. The more the school is deemed to be a failing school, the more those kinds of students are funneled into that school a few years before the closing. So we really have set up, some people think, a kind of a trap there.
And in a lot of ways, I'd agree. I mean, a lot of this, would require, and if we want to explain to people, a bit of public education. And that's a job for the mayor, that's a job for the chancellor, to be talking about how we look at children differently, how no two children are the same, different levels of education, and that just needs to be a real focus. That doesn't happen right now.
Will the Common Core, do you think, contribute to this notion of what all children need to know? Will it be a benefit, or how do you see the Common Core?
Well, I see it as a move in some ways for a little bit of a more national focus to education. What are students learning around the country? There are variations within each location and each school district, and that's fine. But at a certain point, the need to be able to say how we're doing compared to students from around the country, because in the end, we're all competing. Our children wind up competing not just with students in the country, but students around the world. And I think it's a realization of that.
Where our standing is not so great.
A little tenuous these days.
Some further studies are showing that if you take poverty out of the equation, we do not so badly. But that we have a lot of students who really have great economic needs that really contribute. And I think we don't pay attention to that maybe either.
And it's a realization, a recognition of where students need assistance, realizing that poverty is one of the factors, and not running away from it, but running towards it. And how do we, as a nation in this regard, how do we provide for students who are poor, who at times, based on income of their families, aren't as well prepared? We need to do a better job at that.
Will we have the money, and where will we get the money to do some of these things like saving arts education, doing phys ed, having smaller class sizes in the earlier grades? As mayor, where will we find that?
Look, there is a lot of money in education these days, but there's also a lot of money that has been filtered out of the system. There's money that has gone to outside contracts and contracting out. There are tens of millions of dollars that have gone outside of our system right now that we could look and bring back in. So money's there, but could be better allocated. Absolutely.
They're signaling to me that we're almost out of time, so I want to give you a few minutes that if you were mayor tomorrow, what would be one of the first things you would implement? What direction will you take us in, and what can we expect?
I think that the first thing that I would do would be to bring a chancellor in who's an educator.
Okay.
We've lived through the Joel Kleins, Kathy Blacks, and in all due respect, the Dennis Walcotts. None of them are educators. When I was at the Board of Education, I had the chance to work with people like Ray Cortinez, who was a good educator, and Rudy Crew, who was another excellent educator. It matters.
Give education back to the educators.
Well,
yes.
when you have a problem, when you're sick, you don't go to see an auto mechanic. You go to see a doctor. You go to see somebody who has the background and understands. That's the first thing. It also would be nice if we started to talk about an educational vision that a chancellor and a mayor talked about with yearly incremental views of that. What should you expect to see in the year 2013, in the school year 2014? That doesn't exist right now. I think that's important. Creating a more collaborative environment within the public school system. So it's not always finger pointing. We're not always trying to beat people up. We're trying to work together and create a very different atmosphere. Involving parents, a parent university and involving them. Re-empowering, at least for evaluation purposes. I don't want to rebuild an old bureaucracy with school districts, but I'd like to empower superintendents again. That's an additional place for parents to be able to go, an additional person who can help evaluate principals and provide the support that principals need to be able to succeed. So many things that can be done in this school system, but in the end, what we need to do is to better prepare our students so that as we look at, say, at CUNY, what's the number now? Is it 81% of our high school graduates who can't get, I thought it was 71, someone said that number's going up.
Only 21% graduate and complete a 2-year or a 4-year degree, according to the data. And our graduation rate is not so great from the high schools either. So
as we look at our high school graduates, who right now it is somewhere between 70 and 80% of our high school graduates who can't get into the four-year CUNY institutions because they can't do college level work. We are, we need to see graduates who, when they finish, either can go to college or the world of work with the skills that they need to succeed. That's what I want to accomplish, and I believe it can be done, but we at the same point need to work collaboratively and move forward together in one direction.
I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for laying out your vision. It's one that I think certainly we should be paying attention to.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us today on EdCast.
A pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Please don't go away. We'll be right back.
If you have any comments or suggestions, we'd like to hear from you. Drop us an email at cunyedcast@gmail.com.
Mr. Thompson mentioned addressing parental involvement in schools and the fact that parents should have more influence in schools. I'm wondering if that will also extend to parents having an impact on policy making in schools, which is something that they really feel they've been left out of during the Bloomberg years.
Yeah, we've seen that in many of the shows that we have done recently, particularly in the school closing episode we did recently. I had an opportunity to speak to Sandra Lerner, who he mentioned during the interview, who was the Bronx Board of Education representative for many years under his presidency. So let's take a look at that right now. After leaving the Board of Education, Ms. Lerner was appointed by Lehman College President Ricardo Fernandez as his deputy for high schools and educational initiatives. We spoke in her Lehman College office. Having served with Bill Thompson when he was president of the Board of Ed, how would you characterize his tenure as president of the board?
I found it, well, I guess using the word a pleasure. It was great working with Bill. It really was. He was conciliatory, communicative, asked questions when he wanted to study something in depth or didn't have the answers on top. Bill did not come to the board as an educator. And while he was a businessman, there were things about the running of a larger school system in the country that he felt he could acquaint himself with in depth, more than he had. And he did approach those of us on the board who had that kind of background and got the kind of information he needed. And he was supportive of initiatives that came along. I think that we were both fortunate because the superintendent that we worked with for a longer period of time than anyone else on the board was Rudy Crew. And Rudy and his deputy, Judy Rizzo, implemented programs that started to get this city moving. For me, it was in the right direction. And in particular, I would cite the Chancellor's District that was created for underperforming schools. And it was a model to be replicated. It was working, and it meant pouring a lot of resources, into the schools. Unfortunately, it did not last as the Chancellor's District because there was a new chancellor a new structure, and out with the old and in with the new.
Do you think a chancellor's district would work today?
I certainly do.
Yeah.
I certainly do.
As opposed to closing schools?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we're dealing, right now we're shunting kids from one place to another, and where is the education?
What qualities do you think that Bill Thompson would bring to a mayoralty that would prepare him to be a particularly good education mayor?
Well, first of all, let's say, in my experience, Bill is a good politician. I mean, he listens. He listens. The ruffled feathers were not as virulent as one may come to, to think. And sure, there were situations where we all didn't agree, but there was communication. Mayoral controls also the politics of education. Education has two parts. There is the politics of education 101, and then there's education 101. And unfortunately, sometimes the twain don't meet. And the balance to reach that, I think, is something that Bill was able to do. He kept some kind of balance. Didn't always get what I would think was what was needed, whether he agreed, whether it was a decision that he had to make because he had to balance it off something else that was presented to him. He was the president of the board. We all didn't have privy to some of the discussions that he was having. We knew what he shared with us. We know the information that he was gathering, that he would want. You always had the feeling that he listened, which was very important. That was very important to me. I could be as frustrated as can be, but I knew that I had an ear. He never refused to sit down with me, always gave me the time. So it was a good place to vent, because for the borough of the Bronx that I represented, it was really more
Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites.
The humanities and liberal arts seem under attack, and the social sciences are taking an especially big hit. In February, Eric Cantor, the Republican House Majority Leader, called for eliminating research and funding for the social sciences and using the money instead for medical research. Is this a legitimate either-or just another way to cut funds for the humanities? Reactions from educators and researchers alike point not only to Thomas Jefferson's connections between the liberal arts and democratic freedom, but also to the not always obvious connections between politics and medicine.
An issue in higher ed has been the slower path to promotion from associate to full professor for women versus men. Now it seems that marriage between scholars carries its own risks. A new survey reveals that female historians who marry male historians take more years to reach full professor than women who had never been married. But men who were married earned their promotions in less time than those who had never been married. The survey also indicates that females make more career sacrifices for family-related reasons than men, and almost twice as many female senior professors reported their marital status as divorced or separated.
So then marriage to a male is not good for your academic health.
I'm glad I'm not married to an academic, so.
To an academic male, for sure.
Yes, okay.
And that's it for this edition of EdCast.
Until next time, class dismissed.